What we know, the background in relation to climate change's impact in New South Wales, we've funded a study across New South Wales and the ACT called NARCLIM. It provides granular data about what the likely impacts of climate change are down to a 10-kilometre grid level. So it provides the data upon which local communities, and this is world-leading research, the data upon which local communities and local authorities can make decisions about what is likely to change based on current knowledge in relation to climate impacts over two horizons, to 2030 and to 2070. The headline is that across New South Wales, we're likely to see temperature increases of around 2.1 degrees by 2070. Now, that doesn't mean much in isolation. Where this comes into real operational assistance is at that granular level, because down to those 10-kilometre grid lots we can determine what local impacts are likely to be. But nevertheless, we know that the temperature is rising. We know that that is going to have an impact in relation to agriculture, in relation to bushfire planning, in relation to metropolitan coastal planning. We know that in terms of impacts in summer, for example, temperature rises are likely to be higher. We know that rainfall patterns are likely to be different, that at the moment we're likely to see wetter autumns and drier springs, which of course means that the bushfire season will become longer. We know also from work concomitantly being done within the Sydney Institute of Marine Science that sea temperatures off Sydney are likely to rise by a factor of about 3 degrees over the same period. And of course this brings with it a change in the nature or the dynamism of coastal processes. We know that there's likely to be changes in relation to swell direction, which means in itself that the impacts on headlands and on beaches, particularly the southern ends, as we get fewer systems from the south and more systems from the east in terms of east coast lows and from the north, are likely to have different impacts on our beaches and our embayments. So we have a good and robust information base for the first time really to start making quite granular decisions at a local level about what we need to do to adapt our communities and make them more resilient to impacts of climate change. Now, resilience is a word that's now entered into the academic milieu in relation to these terms, but I'm referring to it in the original sense of C.S. Hollings when he was talking about ecological resilience, that is the ability of an ecosystem to recover from shocks to its pre-existing condition. Now, the challenge with that and the adaptive management that C.S. Hollings then went on to talk mainly about is it requires systems to be reasonably flexible and that not only flexible but able to change in new directions based on changing parameters around them. The difficulty in my world of metropolitan planning, which creates so much path dependency in relation to the development of communities, in relation to people's lives effectively. Once we make decisions in an urban planning context about where roads go, where railways go, where housing supply goes, that locks in patterns of development that shape how people's lives are shaped into the future. That is not a resilient process. In fact, cities by their very nature are quite rigid, quite brittle structures. You only need to think of what happens when a single train derailment happens and that causes chaos right across the system, or when there might be a wet weather event that causes traffic chaos or causes a sewage system to overload. The nature of urban systems are inherently brittle and inherently rigid. So what we know about a changing climate is we're going to need to become more flexible, yet the systems that we're developing are becoming more rigid. So we're forming, if you like, an exquisite tragedy that is a challenge that we have to solve together. And we know that this is a global challenge as well. We know that over the coming decades we're likely to see as much of 70% of humanity living in dense urban cores. In the case of Sydney, for example, we've just tripped over the 5 million mark, and by 2051 we're going to have 8 million people living in the greater metropolitan region. So the city currently, it comprises about 4,000 square kilometres, which is about the same size as Greater London. To put that into context, by 2051 we're going to have a similar population to Greater London as well. So these provide us with some big challenges in relation to planning for climate security effectively in the urban context. And we've got similar development pressures right along our coastline as well. Now, how do we deal with these challenges? I'm going to say a couple of controversial things before talking about what the government is doing. And these are a couple of controversial things because I think we all accept orthodoxies in planning, particularly about, it's funny, 100 years ago, urban planning as a profession was established under the motto of nothing gained through overcrowding, and the garden cities at the time were seen as the model to escape the overcrowded slums of central cities. And yet today, the orthodoxy is we need urban consolidation, we need urban renewal because land is at a premium, we need to be thrifty and efficient with the land resources we have. Now, I think that's right. I think obviously we need to be, but we also need to be careful in context of resilience, in context of a changing climate, to not lock ourselves into patterns of future settlement that create more headaches for us to resolve into the future. We already know that with higher density forms of development that they are more energy intensive. We know from work done within government and also externally, there's a lot of work going on by researchers under Stephen Hamnett, I think, at the University of South Australia, looking at the embodied energy and also the energy consumption of higher density forms of settlement. And the messages are that that actually some of the lower density forms can actually be more efficient if properly retrofitted. But with large tower blocks particularly, it's very difficult to get thermal efficiency. It's very difficult to get on-site energy generation. It's very difficult to store water effectively. It's very difficult to, in an energy efficient way, to get hot water up 30 or 40 floors. And in terms of a built form, and this is one of the problems I think with also our land tenure processes, at the time, Torrens title was a very efficient and expedient way in which to divide real property and assign ownership to it. It was flexible, it was resilient. There could be storms, there could be tempests, there could be bushfires, but at the end of the day, the land was still there, the parcel was still identifiable. When you put it in a high density context, that becomes more challenging because really in a high density context with the development of real property or of Torrens title in terms of strata title, real property is a parcel of air surrounded by carpet and paint that exists only in that space in the sky. It's not a resilient form of development in that sense. With a parcel of land, for a farmer you can change your crop depending on what the weather conditions are. If it's a home on a block of land, you can change the design, you can add bedrooms, you can take them away. With a unit block, the urban form is predetermined and unchangeable. And of course, in 40, 50, 60 years' time, when some of the very large buildings that are being built at the moment start to deteriorate, what at present is an argument between maybe 6 or 12 owners of a strata block at the moment may well become an argument between 500 or 600 owners, many of whom are going to be located overseas, and when you're going to have real risks of bits of buildings falling off into city streets. I'm not saying this to say these aren't things we should be doing. Of course we need to look to densify our cities. But in terms of the question of resilience, we've got to be careful that our structures are designed in such a way that we create systems that themselves are resilient to change. And what we know about our climate is it is going to change. It's going to change in ways that are going to make events much more extreme and much more unpredictable. And I just merely wanted to point out the, if you like, exquisite tragedy that's developing of dealing with these conflicts at the same time as we've got this huge weight of development that we have to deal with. So there are some very big problems that are going to need some very clever minds to resolve over the years into the future. And certainly one of the things that I'm wrestling in my role as Planning Minister is to deal with planning challenges in the present in such a way as not to create headaches in 40, 50 years' time for future governments and societies to have to resolve. One of the ways in which I believe that it's important that we can start to wrestle with these sorts of ideas is by obviously sharing with the experience of other cities. That's why I took the step as Environment Minister, as I was before the election, of joining up with the Climate Group, which is a group of international, of sub-national governments and city governments at an international level, which gets together to discuss fundamentally what the role of sub-national jurisdictions is in relation to climate change, and that is issues of adaptation. Across the world, sub-national governments are generally those that are most directly involved with land use planning, and so adaptation rather than mitigation is something that is very, very much within our bailiwick. And so we have the capacity to learn from some of the great case studies around the world of how to deal with these sorts of issues in other global cities. One of the things that certainly the Office of Environment and Heritage, which is part of the Department of Planning and Environment, the New South Wales Government, has been doing, is been partnering with local government through building resilience grant opportunities. To give you one example, there was a grant recently given to the Broken Hill City Council to look specifically at how the built form in a regional city that under climate projections is going to face an extra 40 very hot days per year, to the extent that the west and northwest of the state is going to see about a third of the year over 35 degrees by 2070. They're obviously going to have real pressures in terms of developing building stock that is able to withstand those sorts of pressures and be comfortable for habitation. So in terms of partnering directly with local councils to come up with design guidelines and criteria that are suitable for different districts. Because one of the things that is very clear in relation to climate modelling is it's not, while you can make grand statements at a very general level, it's very clear that impacts are going to be quite local, and it's important that we are flexible enough to relate to those local impacts. The other interesting pilot that we're working on at the moment is in relation to the urban heat island effect, which there was an interesting article just in this week's, I think it was Sydney Morning Herald, this weekend's Sydney Morning Herald, about the urban heat island effect and its effect within the town centre of Penrith. Penrith is one of the identified regional centres in Sydney's growth plans, a plan for growing Sydney. But what this research has told us is that the town centre of Penrith is significantly hotter than areas to the north in Londonderry or to the south in Mulgoa, which have a greater tree cover and vegetation cover. So one of the ways in which we can deal with the urban heat island effect is being dealt with through a Cool Roads project, which is being run by Michael Mobbs, who might be familiar to many of you out there. And this is a project which we're taking an inner city precinct around Newtown and putting in lighter coloured roads and seeing what the impact of having lighter coloured roads is in terms of reflectivity and actually reducing the urban heat island effect, as well as putting in street trees to try and cool down that precinct, and seeing what impacts that has in relation to energy use in surrounding structures and what the benefits are at a very local scale of actually seeking to cool down our road surfaces, remembering that transportation takes up about 30% of the land area of the city. Related to that is a project that I'm very keen about, which is the Sydney Green Grid project. This has been really the result of some great work that's been done by the New South Wales Government architect, and it's looking at all the bits of land that are left over, the riparian corridors, the bits in public ownership that no one's quite got round to figuring out what to do with, and urban parks, and the way in which this drainage easements, the way in which this grid of public or otherwise unused land might be usefully reimagined as a grid to articulate communities, to differentiate from developed places, and also to serve as a cool sink, if you will, to deal with the consequences of the heat island effect. And that is being funded through green space grants through the Department of Planning and Environment. Finally, I just wanted to refer to the coastal reforms. Obviously, one of the key impacts in relation to climate security is the impacts of rising sea levels and greater storm activity on our coastline. That's something that we're dealing with through coastal reforms, effectively working with local councils to find out what the impacts are, embayment by embayment, of rises in sea level and how that needs to be factored into decisions about development. I'm getting the wind up, but I'm very passionate about this, so I could happily talk for hours. But thank you.